Hi, this is Dick Hyman. I'm speaking with Rabbi Sol Solomon on Dave's Gone By.
Oh, shalom, my friends and my music aficionados. This is your old pal, Rabbi Sol Solomon, talking to you because I'm all jazzed today, because we're going to be talking jazz, specifically jazz piano and keyboard, with a man who is an absolute master at it. As a matter of fact, he was named a jazz master by the National Endowment for the Arts. He was the former jazz artistic director of the 92nd Street Y. He has an honorary degree from Juilliard, and he has done the music, composed and arranged it for movies like Moonstruck and a dozen Woody Allen films. He has been sampled in rap songs by De La Soul, Busta Rhymes, Beck, and Kanye West. As a matter of fact, just a year ago this week, Mayor Bill de Blasio of New York declared July 18th, 2017, Dick Hyman Day. Well, why not have him a year later with us on the phone in the neighborhood? Dick Hyman, welcome and shalom to you.
Well, shalom to you, Rabbi, and thank you very much. I'm glad to be with you.
Oh, and so glad to have you with us. So the first question has to be from me. So, I assume you're Jewish, but do you follow? How Jewish are you?
Well, I am what is called Reformed Jewish, but I've been Jewish all my life. I've had a bar mitzvah, I've been to Israel 3 times, and those are my qualifications.
So how do Israelis respond to jazz music differently, let's say, from Americans and other places you've played?
Oh, well, it has been a number of years since I've been there, but my impression from that time is that they were very enthusiastic, perhaps not quite as informed of the latest developments, which is certainly understandable, but their enthusiasm makes up for that.
What are the latest developments in jazz? Because if you ask the average person, and I am a very, very average person, I kind of lost track after Miles Davis and maybe Herbie Hancock and people like, I haven't really paid attention, shame on me, to jazz for 30 years. What's new?
What's new? Well, I have to say that I am not the most qualified person to answer that question, since more and more I feel myself getting slightly behind the times. But I believe it's further amalgamation of the style of John Coltrane in the playing of various more contemporary players. It's a growing, to my observation, it's a growing relationship with the pop music of the last 20 years, an attempt, as always, to incorporate some of the newer rhythms into jazz performing.
It's interesting that you would comment on that, because you were, on some level, were in the forefront in the 60s and 70s when you put out that, I don't know if I'd call it electronic music, but you used the Moog synthesizer and some other stuff like that. I mean, what pushed you away from doing typical standard piano jazz to really going out there?
Well, let me stress that I never abandoned standard piano jazz. I mean, that's one of the main things that has kept me going through the years. But there was a powerful influence in those times of the impact of electronic music. And the company I was with, which was Command Records, under the leadership of my old friend Enoch Light, were interested in competing with some of the other records which were getting the public's attention. So they allowed me to make a record totally of my own compositions in just about any length and manner that I could come up with. I worked with a very accommodating engineer, and more than engineer, advisor, I would say, whose name he's since passed on, was Walter Sear. And between us, we constructed a number of things. The album did quite well, and one tune on it, the Minotaur, we called it, reference to the old Greek legend, was an instrumental hit. But this is a long time ago. This is back in the 60s.
Do you follow, as just even a listener, if not a musician, do you listen to modern rock and roll? Do you listen to rap and hip-hop and any of that stuff, polka?
I do not find myself fascinated by current pop music, so I have to say negatively, no, I do not much listen to it, but it's difficult to avoid it. So in a general way, I can tell what's going on.
Well, in the same way that I am not that cognizant of jazz music past a certain point, was there a point when you were enjoying top 40 rock and roll, Beatles, the Stones, into...
Well, yes, there certainly was. It was at that time that I was very much involved in recording comparable songs for various record labels in New York when the record industry was highly competitive, and a hit by one set of people would invoke a cover recording by another company. And I was a general studio player of all sorts of things on, as you know, on piano and synthesizer and organ as well. So I felt myself very much in the thick of things then, simply by being a studio player for hire for almost any recording that was going on in those days. But that's a long time ago.
Oh, sure. Do you miss the days of big record labels?
I do. I have noticed that when I speak to sympathetic people such as yourself, and the past comes up, I am stimulated to recall it, and I do remember it in great and usually loving detail. Sometimes the negative, but usually just I'm impressed by how much activity there was in those days for people in my category. And my category included all sorts of musicians, each of whom had specialties. Mine was playing on several keyboard instruments and playing various styles of jazz piano and jazz organ, and being a competent reader and an arranger and conductor of my own things, and so forth. It was excitingly stimulating in those days, and while I lead a calmer life now that I'm in my 90s, I still recollect that time with a lot of joy.
You are 91 years old, right?
That's correct.
Mazel tov. But you're going to be playing on July 18th at the 92nd Street Y, and then, God willing, in December, you're going to be at Dizzy's Jazz Club Coca-Cola in New York City.
That's right.
It's part of Lincoln Center there. But is 91 very different for you than 81 was? Do you travel less? Are you moving less well? Or are you just fine?
It is slightly different. I mean, there is a difference in the decades when you get to be this age. I don't care to travel as much or even to try to stretch out and work quite as much as I used to. It begins to take a toll on you, I've found, and while the toll is not nearly something totally negative, you do tend to want to slow down a little bit.
Do you have to be at the piano every day for practice? Maybe not scales, but do you practice every single day?
Yes, I do, because I have discovered that you had better continue playing your instrument, whether or not you're playing for the public. The instrument demands it.
In your early-ish formative years, you actually did lessons, you won lessons, I think, from the great Teddy Wilson, Benny Goodman's band, and went off on his own, too. What did you learn from Teddy Wilson?
Well, it was more than one. It was 12 lessons.
Oh, mazel, yeah.
That I won in a competitive contest. What did I learn from him? Many things. He was a kind and wise man, and among other things, he taught me the necessity, not just the value, but the necessity of practicing. And we discussed a lot of technical questions about harmony and the proper uses or alterations of harmony of all the songs that jazz people like to play.
There's a thing called alternative harmonies. I mean, what is that? Is that like the chords that Thelonious Monk would play, where there would be a note in there that would not make it a normal triad or something? What do you mean by alternative harmonies?
Well, that's one kind of alteration of alternative harmony. Your chords will become a little more complex and lead you into more than one direction at a given point. But it's also setting up sequences that in standard songs arrive at the same place by a more devious process. If I tell you that perhaps some musicians might understand, instead of going from D7 to 5/7, you go from A minor, then you go to D7, and then you go to 5/7. In other words, you make each chord a double or even a triple approach. It's as though you were flying, descending to earth in a looping maneuver rather than going straight down.
Ooh. You're already getting a little beyond what I can understand.
Well, that's what I was afraid of. So.
No, but you make it interesting. I mean, I'm not saying it was... You can make it so abstruse.
You make it more complex in order that you can be a little more inventive.
I like that. So that's one of the Teddy Wilson things. Did you study with any other major jazz people of note? Or if not study with them, learn from them by playing with them?
Well, I certainly heard most of the people whom I admire. Didn't study with them, but I learned a lot from George Shearing, from Lenny Tristano, from Horace Silver, and from various friends, simply by being in their presence and occasionally playing two pianos with them, such as Hank Jones and Derek Smith, and a number of other partners. You learn from everybody with whom you play, or simply from listening to them on recordings or going to hear them play somewhere in a club.
Actually, when you go to a club and you hear a jazz pianist especially, or you pick them out of the band, or you're listening on a record, can you just enjoy it? Or are you always like, oh, he or she's doing that right now? Or, ooh, if I were playing it, I would do it this way.
Well, there is a danger when you get so professionally involved in an interest such as jazz piano or almost any other kind of performance, in being perhaps too technically involved with how did they do it, and could I do it, and how would I do it, and would I want to do it. You reach all of those ethical and technical considerations. Yes, but at times, if the performance of the person you're listening to is sufficiently direct and exciting and above all those qualifications, you can enjoy it, I would say, without personalizing yourself.
We're talking with Dick Hyman here in the neighborhood. You're probably considered one of the foremost interpreters or just players of Scott Joplin. Is he sort of the founder, the most important person in creating what we, not just ragtime, but in modern jazz?
Well, I suppose so, because most people date modern jazz as having a background in ragtime. If the music had a precedent, and it must have, then it was ragtime, which achieved a popularity in the 1890s and then up until at least World War I. The history of jazz after that is, depending on how critical you want to be, pretty complex and with all sorts of different schools and approaches to the music and the way the music interacted with popular music of the time, which was sometimes almost the same thing. The precedent to all of that was ragtime, yes.
Do you have, aside from yourself, a favorite jazz composer? I mean, a lot of people they say Duke Ellington because they have to, or they really believe it, or who is yours?
Well, I too would say Duke Ellington, not only for the immense number of compositions, but for the variety. I like to refer to Duke Ellington not only of the 40s and 50s when he was very well known, but of the 1920s. His first records, although sometimes crude, were always ingenious and, to my mind, very stimulating.
Now, let me ask, one of the things that you even said that you're known for is being something of a chameleon. You can play other jazz pianists' styles.
Well, I can, and I kind of made a niche for myself by being able to do that. But at the same time, I have tried to come up with some original thinking, and in more recent years, paradoxically, or maybe not, I believe I have. And it doesn't refer explicitly to some of the players I mentioned before, doing my best to do it, and I continue doing that.
Oh, sure. But didn't you even did an album, I think, of the same song as it might have been interpreted by a dozen different jazz people?
I did do that, and I have to say that perhaps that was a bit of a stunt in there. But what I like to do these days is just to take the material that I've been working with and really turn it around, turn it upside down, inside out, and try to combine it with some other pianistic possibilities.
And you are still composing, yeah?
Yeah, I'm still composing.
Didn't you do something in Oregon?
I had a performance of a piece I had in a music festival in Siletz Bay, Oregon, of a piece that I originally wrote as a longish cue for a film dating from, I believe, the early 1990s, perhaps, called Alan and Naomi.
Vaguely
and I
remember.
took one of those cues, and it seemed to me to have possibilities for a lengthening and a reorchestration, and that's what we just performed in Oregon. I enjoyed it. The thing is about 7-8 minutes long, and I've been thinking of ways since then that I could lengthen it even more and make a real total concert performance of it.
What would you call it? Would you call it a song? Do you call it a jazz concerto, if there's such a thing? How do you define something like that? It's a piece.
There is certainly such a thing as a jazz concerto, and I've written several of them. I recently wrote one for my friend Ken Poplowski, the clarinetist. I wrote a clarinet concerto for him, and I've written 2 different piano concerti for myself. A concerto is defined as a piece for a solo instrument and full orchestra. If you have less than a full orchestra, then it's perhaps piano and strings, piano and chamber orchestra, piano and even 2 other instruments. But a concerto refers to a whole orchestra, a big orchestra.
But yours still has a jazz leaning rather than a classical.
Oh, yeah, that's my natural form. But there are a lot of jazz is very flexible. As we say, there are a lot of ways to go.
Now, let me ask you, since we tend to be interested in the personalities of musicians and players, so I'm going to throw some names at you, and hopefully you'll have funny stories or memories or something touching to talk about. For example, any anecdotes about Charlie Parker?
Well, Charlie Parker was an exceedingly nice fellow. I played with him 2 or 3 times. One of them was, as it turned out, the only video performance that he happened to be on in which we see him and hear him playing. There are some others in which he is obviously not playing that particular take. But this one, he was a guest along with Dizzy Gillespie on a program I did, I think in the maybe 1960 or something like that. I was doing a nightly program in New York City on a small television network called Dumont. And Parker and Gillespie were guests to be given an award from Esquire magazine. They were introduced by the writer Leonard Feather. That turned out to be an historic recording. I didn't realize it at the time. So that is the one that's generally accorded the unique possibility of seeing Parker in full performance.
And you'll be playing, as we said, at the club named after Dizzy Gillespie in December.
Yes, I will be playing at Dizzy's Club, which is in New York City at the place called Jazz at Lincoln Center. It'll be my 3rd, maybe even my 4th performance there the week before Christmas as a solo pianist.
Now,
I look forward to that.
Do you have any memories, though, or anecdotes about Dizzy Gillespie?
Well, he was a very pleasant guy, and he was a very funny and showbiz-wise kind of fellow also. A little more, I would say, bombastic than Parker, but they worked together absolutely well.
What about Arthur Godfrey?
Well, Godfrey was hardly a jazz person, but I was his music director for 3 years, way back in the late 50s, I guess, or maybe early 60s. Godfrey was an entertainer whose public acceptance at the time is hard to believe these days when he is being steadily more forgotten, I'm sorry to say. But he was a radio personality. I was his director on a radio show that was heard every morning, and on occasional television shows through the season, the specials. Before my time, he had been even more popular. Unfortunately, the fame that comes with such celebrity kind of diminishes once you were off the scene. And Godfrey gradually became off the scene, and he died some time ago.
Right. You have scored and arranged and sometimes composed music for literally a dozen Woody Allen films.
Well, that's true, and I've done a few films in addition to the ones I did for Woody.
Oh, sure. But working with him, an absolute film genius. We'll stay away from his personal, that side of it. But how did you, did he just say, oh, here's a semi-cut version of the film without music, go do what you do, and then...
Well, it isn't quite as simple as that, because you do have to have a meeting of minds. You do have to have an understanding that the idea that you, as the composer, see is the one that the film writer and producer, in this case both Woody, would like to underscore their scene. You have to have some meetings, and usually what you have in mind can be demonstrated by on the piano. But Woody, in comparison with some other film people I've worked with, was surprisingly undemanding. He had certain things to suggest, but he was open to any suggestions on my part, and there was some trust between us. He was perfectly willing to take any of my suggestions, and I his, of course.
A lot of his movies open with a jazz number, usually a famous old number from the 30s or 40s. Would he pick those, or did sometimes you say, hey, you know what would be a really good...
No, Woody has a great knowledge of music of the past, and I think it's one of his signature moves to select favorite recordings and use those at strategic points in the film. I had to take those into account, of course, so that my score would blend in and out of those moments. Some of Woody's films were entirely that, and my services weren't needed. A couple of others were entirely my contributions, and most of them were mixed. Scores contained scenes by me, and then there might be a bit of a record put in and so forth. It was Woody's decision how his general feeling for the flavor of the film was.
Now, what was the most challenging or complicated movie that you had to score and arrange? Doesn't have to be a Woody film. It can be from somebody else.
Well, the film that I dealt with recently, that I mentioned earlier in our discussion, was an independent film called Alan and Naomi, which has since entered the educational film category and can still be found these days. The very first scene you see, the opening of the film, and through the credits, involves a little boy hopscotching, that is, playing on the grid that you make for yourself with chalk on a city street, on an asphalt street, and hopping from one square to another according to certain rules that I don't really know about. The hopping was the motivation for the kind of music that I succeeded in putting to it, and that scene, which with some other developing scenes from it, lasted about seven or 7.5 minutes.
Wow.
That was a bit of a challenge, and it was sufficiently interesting that I have made a longer score, a longer piece out of it using that material. And in Oregon, we performed that piece with 3 singers and a string quartet, clarinet, piano, percussion, drums, and bass.
A couple more questions here with the wonderful Dick Hyman. Remember that you can go see him in person. You don't even have to wait until December when he's at Dizzy's. He's going to be part of a group of jazz musicians doing the Elegant Piano, where they'll be saluting the aforementioned Teddy Wilson, plus Tommy Flanagan and Hank Jones. This is all happening at the 92nd Street Y over on, 92nd Street and Lexington Avenue, happening on July 18th. For more information about that, please go to 92y.org, 92y.org. And of course, for all things Dick Hyman, go to dickhyman.com. And I have to ask this, and I apologize for asking it in advance, but the Urban Dictionary has mentioned that your name, when they describe you, they say you're the American jazz pianist composer, also known as the man with one of the most unfortunate names of all time. Did you take a lot of crap growing up from kids because of your name?
A moderate amount. But compared with other afflictions, it wasn't really all that bad.
Did you make people call you Richard?
It's a funny name.
Yeah.
But there it is. And I survived.
But you chose, you could have changed it to Richard.
Well, I am officially Richard, but somebody beat me to that. My friend, the late Richard Hyman, was well known as a Richard, so that left me with
it would have been too confusing for people.
I'm certainly a Dick.
I'm not even touched. But what I will touch is, if I got to ask you, you were on the last TV concert of Benny Goodman. So you must have known him. Any Benny Goodman stories or memories?
Well, yeah, but they're not that much different from other people's. So that people who have played with Benny have a combination of these little stories with kind of petulant disagreements about salary and getting the ray, which means a smileless stare from Benny, who didn't like what you're doing at that moment, or for no reason at all. But on the other hand, everybody I've ever known who has played with Benny believes him to be a superlative, believes him to have been a superlative musician, and we're all proud to have played with him. And I played with him very early on, way back 70 years ago, in 1948, when I was just a kid. I went on I believe it was an 8-week tour of Europe with him.
I didn't know that. Wow.
Yeah, we did, and we visited all of Scandinavia and France and England. And
okay, now you got to tell me a story. Give me an anecdote from even that one tour of all those different countries. You were a jazz musician. It was the 1940s. Something weird, something funny, something crazy must have happened.
Well, I don't know that anything really weird happened. It was right after the war, so there was that sensibility, which we don't have now, about playing in Europe. Benny was Benny. He played wonderfully. He didn't pay quite enough money to make everybody happy, but we were all so young, we were just thrilled to be playing with him on any terms at all. It was just a wonderful experience. My wife and I were newly married.
So that was part of it too. I thought maybe, jazz musicians, they get the women, they get the drugs, but you were already kind of settled when that first started.
I'm afraid I've been on the clean side of things for my whole career, and my marriage is now from the same year. It's 70 years old.
Oh my, is your wife still,
Oh yeah, my wife and I still are very happy, and we now live in Florida.
Oh, well, of course, you're Jewish. Where else are you going to live?
That's about it, but that's not quite true. However, that's a funny joke. We do live very happily in Florida in a town called Venice.
Oh, that is a very nice town. Can I ask, what is the key to a 70, God willing, and maybe 80, if things go well, year marriage?
The key to it?
Yeah.
Well, I don't know. Key to it is having a wonderful wife.
Yeah.
And doing your best to get along.
Yeah, sure, you have your ups and downs and things, but to stay together for that long, that's something.
Well, it is, and since we had that memorable anniversary been getting these questions such as yours, and honestly, I don't know the answer. I think we're just very fortunate, and we still have each other.
Now, you have a big discography. I mean, you put out literally dozens of albums back when they were putting out albums.
Yeah.
And people can even go to your website still, and then there's ways they can buy signed copies of vinyl and I think CDs too, and which is fabulous. How much of your work is digitally available, and are you making sure that all these records that at least you have the rights to will be perpetual? They'll be on iTunes. They'll be available to people.
Well, I offer a number of them on my website, but I sometimes just explore on the web to see what other people are doing with them. And if you survive as long as I have, you come to see that even the record labels have changed. Some of my records are out now on labels that I never heard of. And I assume they've gotten the proper licenses, but it's a little bewildering, and I can't really account for all of the issues that they now appear on.
Is it important to you that someone can go and find even your obscure tracks, or are you more concentrated on the music you're doing now, the more recent stuff, etc.?
Well, I try to keep it both ways. I'm still writing things, and I haven't recorded that much except to reissue older things in the last few years. So I have made an effort more recently to list all of the recordings that I've made and to keep them known. And I've made an effort to list them all on the web in one listing or another. I am aware of the body of stuff that I carry around with me, but I'm still looking forward to making some new ones.
Oh, halavai. We've been talking with Dick Hyman here in the neighborhood. Last question for you. Your daughter, Judith, is also a musician. She plays the violin. When she said, Mommy, Daddy, I don't want to be a doctor, I don't want to be a lawyer, I want to go into music, were you happy? Were you like, did you give her advice? What did you tell her?
Well, of course I was happy and gave her a little advice, but she struck out on her own, and she went into an entirely different kind of playing. Although she's a very prolific and accomplished player of general repertoire, classical repertoire, her specialty, not jazz, is bluegrass music of, it has various names, bluegrass, country music, and that sort of thing. And she performs with her husband, who's a banjo guitarist, and for some time they have had a group called the Horseflies, but often she and her husband are performers as a pair.
Well, speaking of talented and accomplished and prolific and quite wonderful, it has been a delight talking with Dick Hyman here on Dave's Gone By. Remember, go see him on July 18th at the 92nd Street Y in Manhattan off of Lexington Avenue, and go see him now, and then almost half a year from now, go back and see him solo at Dizzy's Jazz Club Coca-Cola in New York over at Lincoln Center, too. And God willing, you'll see him a year after that and 10 years beyond that. I wish you long life, great music, wonderful creativity, and shalom to you.
Well, shalom, and I thank you so much for your kind thoughts. It's been a pleasure speaking with you.
You too. Bye-bye now.